All right, so I suggested earlier that approaching the ethics of abortion by attempting to identify the feature that a fetus or a developing baby comes to possess that changes its moral status from something to someone, and now includes it in our circle of moral considerability, is a really difficult way to approach the issue here. And Marquis argues that it's not just difficult, it's also kind of dicey. And it's kind of dicey, Marquis says, because the arguments that we typically make in trying to identify that status-changing feature are arguments that include or exclude too much. Okay, what Marquis means by that is this, is that when we make an argument, there are going to be certain principles that underlie that argument, that we rely on in making that argument. And to be logically consistent, we should be willing to have those principles apply equally in similar kinds of situations. Let me give you an example. So let's say I made the argument to you that we should pass a law that prohibits siblings, biologically related brothers and sisters, from getting married because, here's my principle, because the offspring of such a union is more likely to suffer from genetic anomalies and birth defects than the offspring of non-biologically related parents. You say, okay, well, that sounds fair enough to me. Well, to be logically consistent, if my principle is preventing the birth of genetically defective offspring, then wouldn't my law also have to include prohibitions against people with genetic predispositions for certain diseases to get married? Wouldn't I have to include in my law, to be consistent, prohibitions on people with genetic predispositions to Tay-Sachs, or sickle cell anemia, or heart disease, or diabetes? I mean, we can rattle off the laundry list here of people who have an increased like of having genetically defective offspring. And so we'd say, well, no. This argument includes too much. To be consistent, I would have to be excluding too many people from getting married. So I revised my argument and said, okay, guys, so let's just narrow this gap a little bit and say that we're going to pass a law that doesn't prohibit anybody in particular from getting married. It simply mandates that only people who are able to demonstrate that they don't have any genetic predispositions and they don't have anything that's going to make it more likely that their offspring will have genetic defects, only they can get married. And you think like, well, wait a minute here. That doesn't seem fair either, because now you're excluding too much. You're keeping couples from getting married that may very well not have offspring that have genetic defects, even though they have genetic predispositions towards particular diseases and defects. Okay, and so that would be an example of an argument that excludes too much. So this is the criticism now that Marquis is making about the arguments that we typically make when we try to identify the feature that changes the moral status of a fetus from something into someone. And these arguments, he says, are also arguments that oftentimes include or exclude too much. So, for example, somebody who makes the claim that abortion is immoral may do so because they say this is destroying human life. And destroying human life is immoral. There's this biological category called human life. And there's something about it that's inherently valuable. And because it's inherently valuable, it would be immoral to destroy it. And Marquis is going to say, okay, but if you're going to be logically consistent, then you would have to say that if the reason it's wrong to terminate a pregnancy, to abort a fetus, is that in doing so you are destroying human life, then to be consistent, you'd have to say that destroying cancer cells with chemotherapy is also immoral, because human cancer cells are human life. And if the reason it's wrong to abort a fetus is that it's human life, then we'd have to say, well, to be consistent, I have to oppose chemotherapy because it also destroys human life. On the other hand, somebody who thinks that abortion is morally permissible because a fetus is just a cluster of cells, right, just a cluster of cells, is going to run into a similar kind of problem, right? They're relying again on a biological category, human life, cluster of cells. And Marquis is going to say, well, okay, it's just a cluster of cells. Well, so am I. And so are you. We're just clusters of cells. Right? That this person right here is just cellular tissue and organs and blood and guts and all of the stuff that makes us the things that we are. So if you're going to claim that abortion is morally permissible because a fetus is just a cluster of cells, then what's the thing that you're going to identify that distinguishes you as a cluster of cells from the fetus that would make you justified in claiming that while it's morally permissible to destroy a fetus, it's not morally permissible to destroy you. And another problem with this argument, Marquis might say, is that if you're going to rely on the existence of biological mass in order to determine whether or not abortion is morally permissible, you're sort of implying that there's an inherent value to your status as a biological thing, or to anything as a biological thing. And that raises questions then about the moral status of people who have prosthetic limbs, who have pig hearts, who have any number of artificial body parts that decrease the amount of their biological existence. And Marquis is going to say, does that mean that somehow they have a lesser moral status because there's not as much of them that exists biologically? There's not as much human life there biologically as somebody who doesn't have those prosthetic limbs? And you maybe think to yourself, okay, it's not just that I'm a cluster of cells. It's that I'm a person. I have a consciousness. What matters is not what's going on in my physical body, but what's going on up here in my noggin, right? That I have a personality. I'm a being, right? That what matters here is not biology, but psychology. That what distinguishes me from the fetus is the fact that I have a meanness to me. I have a psychology. I have a personality. I have an awareness, a consciousness of this world. And Marquis is going to say, like, well, okay, so now we have to consider the moral status of somebody when they're in a coma or when they are having surgery and are under anesthesia. If you've ever had surgery, I had surgery a couple of years ago, back surgery. It lasted about 12 hours. I went into that operating room. I remember feeling a little funky as they started me on the IV thing for the anesthesia. And then all of a sudden I opened my eyes and it's like I'm in a different room. I'm hurting and I have no memory of any of that. I mean, it was just like a flash. And you have to wonder, it's like, well, where was I? I know where my biological body was, but where was that consciousness that I want to claim makes me special, that gives me special moral status beyond just my biological being? And Marquis is going to say, yeah, and even think about those newborn babies. They're sitting there in those incubators, 5 hours old. Did they have some significantly greater degree of psychological existence than they did 5 hours before? Because if it's the existence of that psychological consciousness that matters ethically, and we're going to say that abortion is morally permissible because a fetus doesn't have it, well, then to be consistent, would we have to accept the murdering of newborn children who are in the maternity ward? On the other hand, maybe we say, okay, no, abortion is immoral because a fetus or a baby it either has or it has the potential for personality and consciousness, right? Not that it has it. We're not making that claim. We're just saying it has the potential for it. And Marquis is going to say, okay, potential, you're going down a dicey road here. Does that mean that Sonny the robot also has a psychology, has a psychological existence? And we're going to look at this in a few weeks when we look at AI. If we can create personality and consciousness in AI, in robots, does that mean that these robots now come into our circle of moral considerability? Okay, so these are arguments that include or exclude too much, and this is what causes Marquis to say, don't go down this road. This is not going to be a road that allows you to effectively address the ethics of abortion. And just as a side note, the image of this guy right here, this is an image that was put on the cover of a study that was done by some social psychologists. They published it in a journal. And the study claimed that the fashion trends of hipsters were really narrow, that they were claiming, hipsters, they kind of all look the same. And so they did their study, they put it out, and this guy, who's a grad student, wrote them a letter and said, hey, you used an image of me for your journal article, and I never gave you permission to use this photo of me. And they had the delightful experience of emailing this guy back and saying, actually, dude, that's not you. But you just made our argument for us. This is some other guy that we thought looked like a typical hipster, and he's so typical in his hipsterness that you mistook him for yourself. All right, so enough of that. All right, so Marquis is saying here, these paths, looking towards the biological qualities, looking towards the psychological qualities, these aren't going to work to effectively address the question of abortion and its ethics, because both of these categories, they seem arbitrary, and the arguments that we use related to them seem to include or exclude too much. So what's Marquis gonna do?